Hello, welcome. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and it's wonderful to meet you all. Yes, I'm going to be introducing choline, explaining what it is and where we are presently regarding choline, looking at consumption patterns and food sources. So here are my declarations. I was previous academic, as already mentioned, for 10 years, teaching nutritional biochemistry and physiology to dietetic students and medics. But in the last 5 years, I've become a consultant, so I have consulted various different companies. So those that could indirectly be related to choline, I have listed here. But presently, I'm mainly a writer. I do a lot of scientific writing, and I also published a book in 2011 with Wiley Blackwell, a textbook called Nutrition in the Childbearing Years, which is used widely by midwives and obstetricians. So, what is choline? Let's start by defining it and explaining it. We'll look at the recommendations, and we'll look at habitual intakes and food trends as well. And the diet is shifting at an alarming pace, so we can look at how that is going to affect choline intakes and status in the future. I've also written a recent paper which was published in the British Medical Journal, and that was really interesting because it provided information about how people interpret choline, their awareness, their present awareness, and misconceptions. So I'll be taking a look at that as well. So what is choline? It is a B vitamin. It is part of the B vitamin family, and we have got an analogy here. So I very much like to liken it to omega-3 fatty acids, in that it is an essential nutrient. And in fact, it was defined by the Institute of Medicine in 1998 as an essential nutrient. It's essential because we can only produce it endogenously in very small amounts. So it is essential that we obtain it from dietary sources. And if we're not getting it from dietary sources, we will then need it from alternative sources, such as supplements or fortified foods. So we do produce it in the liver, but in very small amounts. So it's really important to get it from the diet. We'll be looking at why we need choline in subsequent presentations. But just to summarize, it's really important for neurotransmitter synthesis, the formation of acetylcholine, and for cell membrane structure. And in Europe, the European Food Safety Authority, you may be aware, have approved 3 health claims for choline. So one is that choline is needed for lipid metabolism, the other that it is needed for healthy liver function, and the third that it is needed for the reduction of homocysteine levels. So, choline, where can we obtain it from? Which food sources? Well, we can see here, and this is choline in milligrams per portion. I think it's really important to present it per portion because it's more realistic than per 100 grams. But we can see that predominantly it is animal-based foods. So eggs are very rich in choline, beef, and then chicken, oily fish. We can get it from plant-based foods. So here we've got soybeans, a bit further down here, tofu, quinoa, and broccoli, Brussels sprouts. But we have to work harder, okay? So it's easier to get choline from animal-based foods, eggs, meat, dairy, okay? And this is important to consider given current dietary trends, which I'll be discussing. So at present, this is UK data from the UK National Diet and Nutrition Survey. We can see now that environmentally, yes, we've got to start thinking globally about sustainability and food production, and we can see that it's starting to impact on dietary habits. So over the last 10 years, in the UK, there has been a shift in red meat intakes by around 10 grams, about a 10-gram decline. Okay, and I think we will see further declines in the future. This is another study, 2017, which it looks at dietary patterns. And we can see here, if we look at eggs, we have egg consumers versus non-consumers, and then we have the guidelines, the US recommendation of 425 milligrams per day. So we can see for egg non-consumers, there is a greater gap between their choline intake and recommendations. And similarly for protein non-consumers. So in this paper, that refers to those not consuming meat, dairy, or seafood products. So how many of you have read this scientific paper by The Lancet? Any idea? No? Ooh, this is interesting. Okay, so this was published in January, and it was published in The Lancet and the subsection of The Lancet called Planetary Health. This paper is called Food in the Anthropocene, and it basically shows that we need to shift our diets and consume a predominantly plant-based diet to help reduce carbon footprints, okay? So the new sustainable diet is predominantly plant-based, okay? Which is really interesting. It's really important from an environmental perspective, but what has been overlooked is how this will affect choline intakes and choline status. So great for the environment, but is it so great for micronutrients? Big question. So this is the planetary plate here. So you can see that the sector for animal source protein, just highlighted in red there, is reduced considerably. You have a greater sector for plant source protein, such as beans and lentils, but it is 50% plant-based. Okay. These are current food models, so I've included the Austrian food pyramid, and in the UK, we have the Eat Well guide. These are at present, but I predict that these will very likely change. Already, New Zealand is now adopting a model very similar to the planetary plate, and I believe this trend is now going to shift across the board. So in the UK, unfortunately, we are behind, as with most things at the moment. These are our dietary guidelines, and you can see that we have an inclusion for folate and B12, but for choline, there is a gap. Choline is not included within the UK dietary recommendations. It is overlooked. In the States and in Europe, there are formal choline recommendations. So we can see here in the States, the Institute of Medicine, for the females, it's 425 milligrams per day, and there's an incremental increase for pregnancy and lactation based on fetal growth and weight gain. In Europe, the European Food Safety Authority has an adequate intake guideline for adults, which is 400. And in pregnancy, that increases to 480, and even further for lactation to 520. But how much are we consuming, and how does this compare in relation to guidelines? So this is one of the best studies that have been published today by Veneman in the British Journal of Nutrition. So these are the European guidelines up here, 400 milligrams per day. And we can see that there are gaps, particularly for the UK. But we do need ongoing studies. And we don't need to just use 24-hour food recalls to monitor choline intakes. We need to look at long-term choline intakes over a period of a month, for example, that are reflective of true dietary patterns. This is another study focusing on females, a Canadian study. These are pregnant Canadian females. A really good study because it broke it down into trimesters. And you can see in the first, second, third trimester, consistently there are gaps between intakes and benchmarks, and particularly in lactation when the increment is higher for choline. The same study, and again, we do need more studies looking at supplementation, looked at supplementation use in pregnancy, and the percentage of women taking supplements containing choline, and it was less than 5% that contained choline supplements. And we can see it was higher in the first trimester, and then it sort of teetered off in the second and third trimesters, and was level in the third trimester and lactation. So what are the ramifications? So we'll be hearing more about this in the next two presentations, but fatty liver disease, muscle damage, liver steatosis, and then increased risk of poor neurocognitive outcomes, particularly in infancy. And who is at risk? Those with the genetic polymorphisms, as we see with folate and folate metabolism as well. The same appears to ring true for choline. And those on particular diets, i.e. avoiding meat, veganism, or on these form of reduction diets. And what do we know? We know that about only 1 in 5 women in pregnancy are meeting these adequate intake thresholds, and about 1 in 10 in lactation. And this is best case scenario. It could be predicted that this will exacerbate in the future as these dietary shifts filter through. So we've already mentioned this. The states are ahead. There's 2 key bodies which now advocate choline and are increasing choline awareness. So the American Academy of Pediatrics says that beyond good nutrition, we should be looking at brain nutrition in infancy and childhood. And again, the American Medical Association also recommend now and advocate that evidence-based amounts of choline should be included within prenatal supplements. Australia ahead, and the States are ahead, lagging behind in the UK. So in Australia, they now also include choline within their food composition database, which is really important because you can then quantify habitual intakes from this. And very similarly to the States, in Australia, less than 10% of the population are achieving adequate choline. A similar story across the board, and again, eggs were the top food source contributing choline. So in the UK specifically, unfortunately, our database, our food composition database, choline is omitted. Therefore, it's omitted from the large dietary survey known as the National Diet and Nutrition Survey. It's lacking from the dietary guidelines, and it's lacking from preconception supplementation strategies. So there's a lot of work to be done. So given this, I wrote a very recent publication, which was published just in August of this year in the British Medical Journal, and it was the sector Preventative Health and Nutrition. I just wanted to mention that I wrote this book here, Nutrition in the Childbearing Years, back in 2011. And within that book, there is a section on choline. So choline is not new, okay? It's been around, but information and studies over the last 5 years in particular have started to build, okay? So this paper came out August this year, and there was a lot of press coverage. And it was just to really promote awareness in the UK and the fact that we have omitted it from the survey and the databases. And this was so interesting because it gave great insight into people's perceptions of choline and awareness of choline and how they see choline. So this is some of the coverage. It's a brain nutrient that vegans need to know about. Should it be seen as being aligned with vitamin B12, i.e. those following a plant-based diet need B12, hence they may also need choline. So yes, so it did shift a little bit from awareness to this, this vegan interest. I just really wanted to include this because I think this is really important, and I'd also value, maybe we do the Q&As, your opinions on this. But this was a statement that was produced by the Vegan Society. You do not need to take a choline supplement when you switch totally to a plant-based diet. If you eat a balanced and varied diet containing plenty of minimally processed plant foods, the evidence base shows that this way of eating can support excellent health. So perhaps excellent health in terms of heart health, perhaps excellent health in terms of blood lipid levels, but not necessarily neurocognitive outcomes. And where is this evidence base coming from? Because there are no studies, none that I'm aware of, that have looked at choline intake and status when following a plant-based diet or if you're vegan. So I think this is potentially misleading and potentially dangerous, but it just shows how some people believe in sort of optimistic bias. My diet is perfect. I can obtain this nutrient. A very new study just came out, I think, within the last month. Really important point. This study looks at folate and choline, intakes and absorption of nutrients. And this is something that we need to look at now, is bioavailability of choline from different food sources, and does it vary between foods? So this is shifting in the right direction. So really good paper there. So in terms of future research, where do we need to go? Well, yes, we need more studies in the UK, Europe, and further afield, looking at habitual choline intakes, but more importantly, choline status. We also need to look at different dietary habits, different dietary patterns, the effects of ethnicity, age, and use gold standard methodologies to do this. Alongside this, we need to audit supplementation usage. So just to round up, choline is a really important nutrient. It is an essential nutrient as defined in 1998 by the Institute of Medicine, but it's particularly important during the childbearing years and pregnancy and lactation, as we'll see in the next two presentations. But looking at where we are, we're currently not meeting these guidelines, and that is not accounting for these dramatic dietary shifts that are now beginning to occur, which is concerning. So then we need to look at other ways of obtaining choline. And also, as we saw from that paper, there are many misconceptions, many disbeliefs when it comes to general choline awareness. Thank you.